Welcome. Welcome to the PSI Merit Impactful Research Conference. I'm Jonathan Sherbino. I know many of you. I'm the Assistant Dean for Education Research here at McMaster, but more importantly, I'm associated with Merit. If you don't know who Merit is, we would love for you to discover a little bit more about us. We are a community of scholars and clinicians, all seeking to have a better understanding of how health professions education can be disseminated, improved, and advanced. And so you can find a little bit more about us at merit.mcmaster.ca. It is really a delight to see faces here as we continue the fourth year of this conference sponsored by Physician Services Incorporated. We're really in the debt to PSI for offering us this unrestricted educational grant and to make possible this venue. It's a venue that it's a conference that we've been conducting over the 4 years, initially in person, and then we managed to do it via Zoom. And thank God we're back to in person again. If nothing else, I think that's a win for us. We've had a theme that we've tried to navigate over these 4 years around how do we think about research, but not from the sense of let's talk about our methodologies or our problems or some of the resource constraints that we experience, but more, what does it mean for us as the research enterprise, or how it impacts us as scholars? How do we think about what is going on? We've asked questions of what does equity mean as we think about research metrics and advancement and gendering here in the academy. We started to think about who is part of our teams. How do we construct and constitute? And what does that mean to the influence? We've talked about the idea of mentoring. None of us have arrived here fully formed as successful scholars or researchers. And no matter where you are on the trajectory you have as an academic, you've stood on the shoulders of others who have encouraged you, who've seen you, who've supported you, who've opened doors for you. And now we're going to have a conversation, I think that's really interesting. How does research impact us? What happens in terms of deciding what are the questions I'm going to pursue? All of us have a theme or a passion that's brought us to this conversation. And sometimes we've had to navigate and choose those questions. Those are challenging questions. And we're going to hear about that. We need to think about what's the impact of our research on our research populations. Do we think of them in abstractness, or do we think of them as partners co-creating the knowledge that we generate from the studies that we conduct? Then we need to think about the impact of research on us. We all tell the great stories to our friends and maybe to our families, but I suspect there's stories that you don't tell to many, and perhaps there's a few stories you haven't told to anyone about challenges you faced as you navigated that tricky and rocky road of what it means to be a researcher. Those are the conversations we're going to have today. And it's going to be a conversation. And I think that is what is going to be the power of our time this afternoon. So before we begin, I just certainly want to begin with an acknowledgement that here at McMaster, where we're meeting today and where much of our research has been conducted, we don't come to it in isolation, but in fact, these are the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee nations. And I think particularly as we have that conversation around research and the impact of our communities, we need to think historically about some of our practices that have put us in conflict and that we should rectify and consider. And we should think prospectively and imagine, how should we engage as settlers in this land? So let's take a moment to pause and reflect for ourselves. I mentioned this is a conversation. We're going to hear a plenary, and then at each of your tables, there's a facilitator. And at the conclusion of the first half of the plenary, there will be an opportunity for you to engage in the ideas, because we need to dialogue. We need to unpack some of the thorny questions and the uncomfortable themes that are brought to us. And then your facilitator will capture a portion, not the entirety of your conversation, and share it back so that all of us can benefit from the conversations that are happening at each of the table. And then we'll invite a plenary speaker to respond and to bring some of those themes together. But there's no promise of a nice tidy bow at the end. Many questions I suspect will be unanswered because there may not be easy answers. We want to have interesting conversations and not simplistic ones. We're going to have some breaks, but the best part of this is at the conclusion, we want to have you join us for just a conversation without Zoom tiles, without figuring out whether you're on or off mute, and to see and reconnect in person with friends. And perhaps by the end of the day, you've made new colleagues and acquaintances that are going to have impact on your research moving forward. See what I just did there? Trying to look at that. So you are tired of hearing from me. I really would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Harriet MacMillan. Dr. MacMillan is a psychiatrist and pediatrician who conducts family violence research. She's a member of the Offord Center for Child Studies, a distinguished university professor in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences and pediatrics. She holds the Chinook Health Chair in Child Psychiatry. Her research focuses on the epidemiology of violence against children and women. She has conducted landmark randomized controlled trials evaluating interventions to reduce child maltreatment, intimate partner violence, and associated mental health impairments. Harriet is a clinician with a child advocacy and assessment program at McMaster Children's Hospital and the current lead for the Violence Evidence Guidance Action, VEGA project, which develops evidence-based resources to assist healthcare and social service providers to recognize and respond to family violence. Harriet works closely with the Public Health Agency of Canada and the World Health Organization. That's a very daunting bio. What I know about Dr. MacMillan is she's very patient, particularly with me, and very generous with her colleagues and her collaborators and all those that she meets in a professional way. And so thank you, Dr. MacMillan, for the generosity of your time. As you talk to us about the 10 Ps for surviving the perils of publish or perish, that alliteration I got to without just throwing off, of conducting impactful research. Dr. MacMillan.
Jonathan, you're a bit taller than me, so just give me a moment here. Yeah, okay. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, thanks, Jonathan, for your very kind words, and to you and Deborah and the planning committee for including me in today's conference. And good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to join with all of you today in having these discussions about the important topic of impactful research. Now, when Jonathan asked me to speak at today's conference, he asked me to offer comments on the pressures that scientists experience to publish, to obtain grant support, to meet certain metrics, and how they can become a barrier to pursuing certain types of research. Now, just to be clear, I am not an expert in research metrics by any means, but I do believe very strongly in the need to support researchers in pursuing meaningful questions and not being driven by the pressure to meet the numbers. So I'm very pleased to offer my perspectives on, and Jonathan, you've already said the title for me, so I don't need to struggle with the 10 Ps. So this is what I'm talking about today. And I should say hello to those of you who were streaming with. So I know you're out there. So first of all, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So before getting to the 10 Ps, which is actually my third objective, I want to begin by discussing the concept of audit culture in relation to academia, and then reviewing some principles and recommendations aimed at revising the assessment of research impact. But first, a few comments about the phrase publish or perish. Now, this phrase existed long before the phrase audit culture. And in fact, it actually appeared in 1942. That's the first time it appeared in an academic paper, but it's not clear who coined the phrase. However, as stated by Spooner in 2018, what's new is the sheer magnitude, depth, and ubiquity of audit culture's implementation and pervasiveness. Now, according to Shore in a 2008 article, the phrase audit culture was first coined by sociologists and anthropologists to describe a condition influenced by the principles of financial audit, but in places other than finance. On this slide is how Sparks refers to it as the quantification and evaluation of academic work, along with an increasing dependence on these quantitative measures to define and assess productivity and efficiency, as well as the types of reputations outlined on the slide. Tourish argues in a 2019 chapter that while accountability is reasonable, the systems designed to ensure accountability have overwhelmed what we as academics are trying to do. Tourish suggests that the current audit culture encourages more focus on the journal in which an article is published than the actual ideas contained in the articles, and goes on to say that when researchers are defined by metrics, it can marginalize novel methods and theories. There's been a lot of interest in this in the UK. A report by the Higher Education Funding Council in 2015 was entitled "The Metric Tide," a very apt description. Now, one of the most prominent metrics in academia currently is the H-index. How many of you either use or come across the H-index? I see some shaking of heads and yes, okay. Well, again, just in case people aren't familiar with it, this index was proposed in 2005 by Jorge Hirsch, a physicist, as a way of comparing individual scholars competing for the same resources. And the idea was it was supposed to be a less biased approach. Now, it's calculated by taking the highest number of publications with the highest number of citations. So in this slide, it's where those two green lines come together. So for example, if there are 10 publications and each of those publications is cited 10 times, then that's an H-index of 10. So even if one of those publications was cited by 10,000 different papers, it would still be an H-index of 10. Now, assessing research and productivity is a complex phenomenon. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for the H-index when it came out. It was viewed as a way of simplifying the process. And in fact, as outlined here, the H-index is featured in several different databases. So there are a lot of strong proponents of the H-index, but there's also a lot of criticism, especially in recent years. First of all, it's geographically biased and it favors English language journals. It doesn't reflect authorship contributions. For example, the H-index doesn't consider whether one is first or senior or the middle author. It says nothing about the specific contribution made by the author. It's not used consistently across fields. Researchers working in fields with high citation frequencies may have a biased H-index. Various metrics have been proposed to address these problems. For example, the stratified H-index supplements the conventional H-index by taking individual author contributions into account. And the E-index considers those excess citations beyond the H-index. Now, turning to the second objective, I plan to describe a few system-level approaches which have been developed to improve the assessment of research impact. The first is DORA, which stands for Declaration on Research Assessment. The ideas for this declaration were developed in 2012 in San Francisco at the annual meeting of the American Society for Cell Biology. Now, the declaration's focus is to improve the way in which researchers and their research are evaluated. DORA has developed recommendations, and the themes that serve as the foundation for them are as follows. First of all, not using journal-based metrics such as the journal impact factor as a measure of research quality. It shouldn't be used in comparing the scientific output of individuals or institutions. Second, recognizing that use of scholarly outputs other than journal articles will increase in the future. In fact, it already is. And number three, assessing research on its own merits. They do say, however, with the DORA recommendations, that while research is shared in many different ways beyond the research article, the peer-reviewed publication will continue, certainly for now, as a central output on which research assessment is based. Now, the declaration led to the development of 18 recommendations, mainly focused on peer-reviewed publications, but it can extend to other types of outputs. And the emphasis is on more meaningful approaches to research evaluation than journal-based metrics. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 18 recommendations right now, but I'm going to give you some examples. So for funding agencies and institutions, it's about being explicit about the criteria for grant support and promotion. For researchers, when they're involved in committees, decisions should be based on scientific content. And if assessments are happening that rely inappropriately on certain metrics, like impact factors, they should be challenged. Another set of principles aimed at improving research evaluation is referred to as the Leiden Manifesto, named after the city where the International Conference on Science and Technology Indicators took place in 2014. The manifesto outlines 10 principles offered as best practice in research assessment that is based on metrics. So these authors make the point that research metrics actually can provide some useful information, but they shouldn't replace judgment. So you can see what I'm trying to do is give you these different perspectives that people are discussing at the current time. They say the best decisions are made by combining data with attention to the nature and aim of the research. Both quantitative and qualitative assessment are needed. Each is important, but quantitative measures should not take over. The actual content of a researcher's written work is more important than a number. And there needs to be consideration for variation across fields in publication and citation practices. I'd like to add a personal note here that as a reviewer for funding applications in Canada and elsewhere, I find when there's a request to an investigator to actually provide a narrative of their research impact, to describe what they're doing and why it's important, that is really useful. And also, for example, if they provide a narrative about their key publications or accomplishments. So that's what we see, for example, in CIHR, when we're asked to provide information about significance of research. The third set of principles that I want to tell you about are the Hong Kong principles for assessing researchers. These were developed as part of the 6th World Conference on Research Integrity in 2019, with the aim of greater recognition for researchers who commit to rigorous and transparent processes. Now, Moher and colleagues acknowledge the contributions of DORA and the Leiden Manifesto, but what they've done then is to develop principles from the research integrity community. These include responsible research, for example, engaging the public where appropriate to do so, and we're going to hear more about that today, transparent reporting through published protocols, open science through data sharing, valuing research that was previously difficult to fund, for example, replication studies, and recognizing the broad array of ways that researchers contribute to scholarly activities like peer review. The authors state that they strongly believe that current metrics may act as perverse incentives in the assessment of researchers, and contend that currently there's more emphasis on the novelty of perceived impact than on rigor. Now, there are other smaller groups and individual efforts that have been summarized really well by Moher and colleagues in 2018. This is a paper on assessing researchers for hiring, promotion, and tenure. And I really encourage you to look at that. For example, they refer to a group that was convened by the National Academy of Science in 2015. And the emphasis was on rewarding for publishing well rather than often. And in grant submissions and promotions, the applicant should be evaluated on selected work rather than numbers. This is happening already, fortunately, in promotion and tenure reviews. For example, when applicants are asked to submit their 5 most impactful papers, and they're asked to say why they consider them to be impactful. Now, given that publishing remains as the foundation of research, how do we survive while hopefully promoting the principles of responsible use of research metrics and determining thoughtful, meaningful ways to capture research impact? How do we ensure that the burden outlined so powerfully on this slide is reduced? How do we avoid this ongoing emphasis on numbers and prioritize quality over quantity? Those at the back may not be able to see this, but it says, yes, a trivial observation, but fodder for at least 5 papers. So the comments that follow are based on 30 years of my experience conducting research in the family violence field. This research was done with many colleagues in a variety of teams, like Melissa Kimber, who's sitting here today, using the types of research methods shown here. Whatever area of research you're working in, I encourage you to think about how what follows might apply to your own work. So first of all, purpose. This may seem so obvious, but as researchers, we need to be clear about the overarching purpose of our research and how the goals, aims, and objectives of the individual projects relate to that purpose. As researchers, we need to ask ourselves, what is my main question? And be prepared to explain it to others. Mentors, colleagues, and department chairs should also be familiar with the purpose of your research, not just how many publications you have or grants, so that they can better support and advocate for you. It's also essential that we advocate for research evaluation that's more tailored to the research purpose. For example, there are different ways of measuring policy impact versus societal impact versus biological impact. My overall goal has been to reduce family violence, including child maltreatment and intimate partner violence and associated impairment. And I've found it really helpful to map out what are the key questions that summarize my research. How do the objectives, goals, and aims of any individual project, how do they fit in to this particular overarching purpose? The second P, not surprising, passion. Research has many challenges, including the barriers posed by the audit culture in asking questions that can take a lot of thought. They can take a lot of time to answer. So one needs to feel passionate about whatever research one is pursuing. Why does this matter to you? And why should it matter to others? One of the current criticisms of research as it exists now was expressed in a 2013 editorial by Kirkpassen, who talked about publishing for its own sake. And he referred to a culture of productivity, that it's become more important than what he referred to as passionate scholarship. Again, in terms of academic practices, assistance should be provided in helping researchers express why they are passionate about their research. And as researchers, we need to make ourselves available to communicate about our research as much as possible with the public, with media, with colleagues, not only at peer review conferences. Speaking personally, when I was a pediatric resident at Sick Kids, I saw children and youth being admitted to hospital who'd been abused and neglected. And the main focus was on identifying the abuse and neglect and reporting this to the Child Protection Agency. But I wanted to know what happened to these children and what would help protect them from further maltreatment. I feel just as passionately about that question today as I did decades ago. Obviously, plans for research projects are essential, but there are many different types of plans. I'm referring to the plan for your program of research. What do you see yourself doing now, in the next year, 5 years from now? If you have a research question that you want to pursue, but it's going to take a long time to get results, let's say a randomized controlled trial with a long follow-up, you need to ask yourself, what is the research leading up to that project that you can do, and then write about it while the other study is ongoing? What related questions can you be addressing and writing about in the meantime while awaiting the results of the longer study? This can help with planning knowledge mobilization as well. So you're not getting caught up in that, oh, I can publish a paper on this, some other topic that you're not really interested in. Now, having emphasized the importance of a research program plan and career plan, I also need to acknowledge that exciting opportunities can come along. So you need to be prepared to pivot and revise your plan. Protected time. Look for what provides you that protected time that is so essential to pursuing meaningful research. Funding agencies and academic institutions need to determine solutions that help provide that protected time. When I was starting out, there was a US foundation that I would never have heard of if it wasn't for two wonderful mentors. It was the W.T. Grant Foundation. They didn't actually have an ambulance, but that's how it felt to me, that I was being rescued because they were providing salary support for me for 5 years to conduct research on child maltreatment. Sometimes there are little known opportunities within Canada and internationally that provide funding to support protected research time. And those in leadership positions within academia need to advocate for resources for protected time, including from funding agencies. Practicalities. Does your institution have the support that you need? Is there the infrastructure, both financial and otherwise, to support you in pursuing the research that you care most deeply about? Or is the emphasis on number of publications and grants? For example, is your research predominantly community-based participatory research and the department where you work has no experience or expertise in that area? Is your research integrated with other aspects of your academic career? Are you responsible for clinical or educational activities that aren't compatible with your research? Partnerships. There are many different types to consider with colleagues, departments, research centers, other organizations. There are actually some areas for which co-production of research between academics and other partners, for example, policymakers, can actually facilitate research impact. Duogen and colleagues have championed the concept of a community of inquiry located between science and practice, where researchers and practitioners can co-produce knowledge. Now, we need to make sure that institutions reward partnerships and teams. We can't have the message that teams are encouraged and then have metrics that disadvantage those who work in teams. Participation in a thoughtful, collegial way. As recommended in the Hong Kong Principles, if we want to influence the system, we need to be part of the process, joining peer review committees, reviewing manuscripts. This can have benefits for our own research, but it can also influence the system, assisting others with their research. At the institutional level, I think it's imperative that people are not penalized because of working closely with others. For example, in an area that overlaps with another colleague. And this thinking has to extend throughout the system. through relationships among teams, centers, institutes, and funding organizations. Perseverance. Peter Zontmari, a previous director of the Offord Center for Child Studies, who's now at the University of Toronto, gave a great presentation recently on how to deal with rejection. Specific practical advice on what to do when a grant or manuscript is rejected. So in addition to support from mentors, there has to be departmental and institutional commitment to sharing approaches to perseverance. I'm so pleased to see that one of the topics today is about the impact of research failures on ourselves. Perspective, not just at the beginning, but throughout. Sometimes people map out their trajectory and continue along a path without taking time to reevaluate and ask themselves, what am I accomplishing? How is this tied to the overall research that means the most to me, that I want to conduct? We can't necessarily predict what happens, but we need to take stock frequently, regularly, and with encouragement from mentorship and leaders. We also need to consider different perspectives with regard to how research is assessed, including our own. This is where the importance of narratives come in. Being asked by others to articulate the impact of one's research, or being part of a process where perspectives about different research questions, projects, and programs are discussed can be both enlightening and inspiring. People are the cornerstone in conducting impactful research. Colleagues, students, trainees, staff, mentors, working with teams, and all roles being acknowledged for their contribution is critical. The emphasis needs to be on equity, diversity, and inclusion with principles of respect, transparency, collegiality, and trust. Ongoing discussions with the people we work with about the pressures we each face and ways we can assist each other in conducting impactful research. So in summary, measurement of scientific contributions should not be based on a single number. Currently, there is an excessive emphasis on quantitative measures. I've discussed examples of principles and processes that are being proposed to improve how research is measured. And there are many more out there. And then the 10 Ps, which I hope might be helpful as suggestions for ways of surviving and maybe even changing the current audit culture. As you reflect on purpose, passion, plan, protected time, practicalities, partnerships, participation, perseverance, perspective, and people, I encourage you to think about how they apply at the individual and at systems levels. We all need to reflect on what governs the research that we are doing so that we can pursue our research without falling prey to the pitfalls so well illustrated here. And again, those of you at the back may not be able to see this, but before grad school, I'm going to research whatever I want. The grad student, I'm going to research whatever my professor wants. Assistant professor, I'm going to research whatever my tenure committee wants. And tenure professor, I'm going to research whatever my grant committee wants until you get to the stage of emeritus professor. I'm going to research in peace. So, and finally, I want to end with a hopeful message, the 11th P of possibilities. Despite the challenge of the audit culture and the seemingly never-ending demands, we are able to collaborate, communicate, and conduct research in ways that even a decade ago never seemed possible. I will leave you with this quote by Nobel laureate and humanitarian Perils, which is, "All things are possible until they are proved impossible, and even the impossible may only be so as of now." Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Deborah. It just means so much to hear you say that. I mean, these are principles, and well, certainly, I mean, so much is out there and continues to be written about as you know, and I tried to give you a glimpse of that in the first part, but indeed the 10 Ps, 11 Ps, are near and dear to my heart, yes. Well, thank you so much. I must admit, I'm daunted by that prospect. And I have to tell you, when Jonathan first asked me to speak, I said, no. But, I care so much about this that ultimately NT is very convincing. So, yes. Yes, but I would be honored and I think we all need to get these messages out there because that's what's going to change the system. We have to change the culture. So, this is where I would say that you helping those other people, that needs to be part of your evaluation as a professor. That's critical. And I think we need to figure out better ways to measure that. Absolutely. And in fact, I would go so far as to say, and maybe this will make you not want me to talk to the PNT, but I would say if somebody is being put forward at the professorial level and they haven't been doing mentorship and helping people, then, to me, they're not meeting those criteria for promotion to professor. So, anyway, so I do tend to talk about it.
Before we all start marching on the dean's office, I'm going to invite you to continue this conversation. Don't worry, Dr. MacMillan's coming back for a wrap up. We'll have just shortly before the hour for your conversations, unless they start to peter out based on the enthusiasm I've heard so far. I don't imagine that to be the case, but we'll come back with an opportunity to share some of the ideas.